Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dear Friends Old plus many new friends too. All thanks to you, our opening night is filled to the rafters.
And I must say, this place is so delightful, and in fact, so is its yeah, please take your seats across here. There's more room here. Yeah. Because our proprietor is a person who is unintimidatable, you'll be glad to know, and very proud to know. So I just thought I would explain a little bit of how come this club is being inaugurated. It's simply that I saw that Dr. James Thring, a retired architect and strategic planner, was really not getting the sort of attention that I felt that he deserved. And so I thought we should start a club where he can bring forward his ideas that are in fact very valuable. And so I shall now, by way of introducing him to those among whom you may not be so familiar. Anyone coming in? I'll give you a little resume of James's background. He's a former architect, as I said, of self-sufficient housing and a former strategic planner with the Department of Environment on the strategy for the Southeast, on the future of planning policy, and on the costs of new town development, until he questioned Mrs. Thatcher's, he says, Rothschild's think tank drive to sell off UK public assets without competition to a New York bank. Shall I stand a little closer? To a New York, that sounds better, doesn't it? Shall I begin again? I think you say, that's all right. I think it was recorded, because we're trying to record these things. He to sell off UK assets without competition to a New York bank, the manufacturer's Hanover Trust. His main focus since has been on Israeli-driven aggression against the Islamic nations, for which he set up Ministry of Peace, and published Israeli Crimes Against the Palestinians, Peace with Iran, and other booklets. He co-founded Legal Action Against War to interdict the invasion of Iraq and prosecute Blair and others. Exactly so, yes, indeed. His last publications were 9/11, The Israeli Links, A Strategy for the UK, and various articles in the magazine Heritage and Destiny. I hereby wish to acknowledge my gratitude to Dr. James Thring, because it was in 2004 actually, when he was very instrumental in organizing via Lord Stoddard to screen my documentary film in the House of Lords. It was called Palestine Scrapbook, and it came about because I by chance happened upon British servicemen who served in Palestine 1945 to 48, and they told a very different account, a real history account of the founding of that criminal state, which is a very different story to the Exodus film that we saw with Paul Newman. And so around about the same time, James has also helped me screen it in the House of Commons when it was updated and called Israel in Flagranti, Caught in Acts of Swindlespeak. So please may we give a warm welcome to Dr. James Thring.
Well, thank you very much for that embarrassing introduction. I'm very grateful. I haven't had one of those for a long time. But we'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm sorry if it's been difficult to find the place, but Michelle did circulate some instructions, which was very good of her. And I also want to thank Harry Eagledon, again, the proprietor, for letting us have the benefits, because when I heard about the usual problems with, well, in fact, I've been to many speeches by David Irving, when we've had to move from one pub to another because of the Antifa and similar groups throwing stones at the windows and so on. And I told Harry this, and he said, "Oh, it's all right, we take things as they come." Marvellous chap. I wouldn't if I'd owned the place, I don't think. Anyway, the club is based on the 4 ancient Greek virtues. It was something that Michel sort of revived, if you like, and they are wisdom, courage, truth, endurance, or justice instead of truth. And I think everybody can subscribe to that kind of principle or set of principles, because they take us away from the left-right type of politics and from the nation versus nation problems and the right versus wrong, the rich versus the poor, and nation. So it kind of absolves us from any kind of labelling as either left wing or right wing or whatever, which I think could be useful. So I was going to say that Lady Renouf won an amazing victory in Germany over her impromptu speech at a meeting commemorating remembering the bombing of Dresden, which David's written a book about in 1945, and she made some comment which made a member of the audience, this was in Dresden itself, say, "Well, what are you British people doing here? You've got no right to be here." And so somebody on the organising stand said, "Come up and tell us what you really mean, you see." And so she said, "Well, Dresden was a real Holocaust," and sort of implying that the other one wasn't. And so that got her arrested. As you probably know, some of you will have been following the thing. And luckily she found a very competent and brave lawyer, Wolfram Narath, in Germany, who managed to persuade the opposition to drop the charges, which were simply, well, we don't really, the alleged charge was that she denied the Holocaust, which of course, just saying that there's another one doesn't deny the previous one if it was one. So she got off in the end, and it was a rather worrying time for her. But as a result, we had a party here to celebrate her victory, and I had this little badge, if you want one, made by Cotterell at Heritage and Destiny, commemorating her victory using what she calls the 4 virtues. So that's the sort of introduction. The aim of the group is really to save our nation, and I think really the world, from a force that most people don't even realise is about to engulf us. Well, it's already started, so you don't have to look very far. And in fact, the latest example was the global lockdown, come vaccination, come dictation as to what we can do, and it'll soon be followed by a fairly high rate of inflation, I suspect, and probably economic crisis of some kind, rather like 1974. And that's not really an off-the-cuff projection, because they're actually talking, as you know, of the Great Reset. Well, what does that mean? They're going to reset the economic system along the lines of the Bitcoin, so that it can be removed if you don't behave. If you've only got Bitcoins, they're actually lodged in a bank. You can hold them, but they will be easy for the people who orchestrate this to grab them and devalue them or increase the value if they want to. It's all being run by a very small group of oligarchs and this is not the Russian oligarchs we're talking about. This is oligarchs who reside mostly in New York and Switzerland and all over the place, so you can't tie them down very easily. And they're in cahoots with the world economic leaders. They have these meetings in Geneva, in Davos, every year, in which they clearly conspire, if I may use that word, to stitch up the world in their favour. And they've got the pharmaceutical companies and the big corporate leaders, and most particularly people like the stakeholders of BlackRock and Vanguard, which are the largest holders of funds in the world. So, and they have you'll see if you look at a film called Monopoly. Have you seen that? It tells you how the pyramid of ownership always seems to end up with them owning most of, or some of, nearly everything that we use. All the companies have got, they have their hands, i.e. investments, in all major companies. Those two companies, BlackRock and Vanguard. And then, of course, there's the people who are slightly more obvious, like the Rockefellers and Bill Gates and Fauci and that nice Mr. Schwab. And they've actually said, Mr. Schwab has actually said, we're going to take ownership of everything. You won't need to worry about ownership of things. We'll control everything for you. It's nice of them, isn't it? So, anyway, for some people, this idea sounds like a conspiracy theory. So at the next meeting, I was going to propose, if you'd like to come again, let's say in a month's time, or maybe 2 months' time, we'd have an opportunity for everybody to say what they think about the world affairs and the way things are going, and how they would like us to do something about it. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be able to do very much, but there may be opportunities through the courts, like Fulmich is doing, over the drug, over the vaccine, and and we'd also want to show this film Monopoly, which is fascinating and seemed very reliably documented. So that's that. I'll let Michelle take over.
Yes.
And do that.
Thank you, Jane. Well, friends, there's no better way, I think, of introducing our very distinguished speaker this evening than to cite Mr. Justice Gray in his judgment against Irving in 2000 in the High Court on the Strand, in which he brought action, civil action, against the Jewish American professor Deborah Lipstadt. She was she sought to undermine his contracts that he had for his books, and to destroy his reputation. At that stage, his reputation was very high. He was a very well-known, for historians, people who are interested in history. Am I standing not so close?
Yeah.
I just stand close. Is that better? But before I read that citation, I would like to give you a little bit of eyewitness background, because I had never been interested particularly in World War II. I didn't know, I'd never heard of David Irving or historical revisionism. But in 2000, I happened to see in the Times newspaper a citation from Irving in which he said that if he were a Jew now, he wouldn't be asking who pulled the trigger, but why? And as it happened, in 1997, I had written a monograph which I'd published on Richard Wagner and Judaism, and in that I had accepted the version, the Hollywood version of what we are told about the trademark called the Holocaust. In fact, I hadn't realized that there is a great similarity between the way products are promoted by hidden persuasion in many of the international television commercials that I myself have acted in all of my life. I thought that the Hollywood version of the Holocaust would be rather different to a TV commercial. I was to discover a very similar background. So I had only asked, if there's a Holocaust, it's a sacrificial burnt offering, it's a religious term, someone had to have offered it. That's all I said in my monograph. And so here was David Irving asking the question, why? Well, of course, I thought he must have been a nutter, because we assume that everything that's written in the newspaper is accurate.
£50,000 instantly!
Yes! I'll have what she's reading.
But I went along to hear what he has to say, because after all, in terms of what James was talking about in my impromptu speech in Dresden, there is a vast difference between a sacrificial burnt offering, which must be whole and perfect, as opposed to cremation, in which nothing is perfect. The person is dead, the person is probably died of an illness, and therefore it is not that is not the kind of offering that one would call and term a Holocaust. So I went along to the High Court, expecting the very opposite of what I discovered there.
Ah, the status that comes with a gold card. Now, it's not just reserved for the privileged few.
Hello and welcome to flight 163. We'd like to start by boarding our valued economy class passengers first.
Introducing the Visa Gold Card from Capital One. The One Gold Card.
I saw in a very small room in the court, on the left-hand side, about 20 lawyers representing Deborah Lipstadt, who were mostly, for the most part, expressing insults toward David Irving, but very little material that one expected, and we're told there were. In fact, there were axonomotic drawings which were conceived by Professor Van Pelt that were based on so-called eyewitness, but that eyewitness had never been examined. But on the other side, on the right-hand side of the court, I saw this historian standing alone, empty benches all around him, rather like David and versus Goliath. And to my shock and dismay, it was he who was producing the forensic material and ignoring the stupid insults and nonsense and telling a story that I had never heard before. And so it was relevant to tell you, I think, that in one lunchtime, down in the canteen in the High Court, Mr. Irving happened to be standing behind me. And he said, "Oh, I've noticed you in the courtroom. What did you think of this morning's session?" And I said, "Well, I couldn't get in because it's so crowded and such a small room." He said, "Well, you can see my benches are all empty. You're most welcome to come and sit in those empty benches," where it appeared, apparently, no one else dared sit. Well, I didn't mind whether people dared or not. It meant that I could then attend every day for the remaining 2 months of that trial. And it was an eye-opener that I had never expected.
With cable and wireless as digital TV, you get selected internet sites that prevent people seeing things they shouldn't. The most advanced digital TV on Earth is here.
This is the judgment now from Mr. Justice Gray, which I witnessed. My assessment is that, as a military historian, Irving has much to commend him. For his works of military history, Irving has undertaken thorough and painstaking research into the archives. He has discovered and disclosed to historians and others many documents which, but for his effort, might have remained unnoticed for years. He collected diaries and so on that no one else had had access to, which he did. That's my aside. It was plain from the way in which he conducted his case and dealt with a sustained and penetrating cross-examination that his knowledge of World War II is unparalleled. His mastery of the detail of the historical documents is remarkable. He is beyond question able and intelligent. I happen to know that his daughter's report at school said that she has lightning intelligence. That's my aside, I'm sorry. He was invariably quick to spot the significance of documents which he had not previously seen. Moreover, he writes his military history in a clear and vivid style. I accept the favourable assessment of Professor Watt and Sir John Keegan of the calibre of Irving's military history and reject too sweeping the negative assessment of Professor Evans. Professor Evans acted as Lipstadt's expert witness. Yet, the words of Professor Evans, that the citation has ended, and this is now my words. The words of Professor Evans, which Mr. Justice Gray therefore rejected, are that Mr. Irving had, quote, a generally low reputation among professional historians since the end of the 1980s, and at all times amongst those who have direct experience of researching in the areas with which he himself is concerned, end quote. So I'd say that was not only sour grapes on the part of Professor Evans, but is also worse because, in fact, I witnessed where he, in fact, eventually perjured himself, because he said that he would not be writing a book and benefiting from the Irving trial, but he did. He was also accorded a knighthood in consequence of the six-figure sum that he earned from being an expert witness against Irving. I am not a groupie. I don't even respect, in fact I despise, people who believe in blind loyalty. I think it's irresponsible.
On 13th February 1945, I was a navigator on one of the Lancaster bombers which devastated Dresden. I well remember the briefing by our group captain. We were told that the Red Army was thrusting towards Dresden and that the town would be crowded with refugees and that the centre of the town would be full of women and children. Our aiming point would be the marketplace. I recall that we were somewhat uneasy, but we did as we were told. We accordingly bombed the target, and on our way back our wireless operator picked up a German broadcast accusing the RAF of terror tactics, and those 65,000 civilians had died. We dismissed this as German propaganda. The penny didn't drop until a few weeks later, when my squadron received a visit from the Crown Film Unit, who were making the wartime propaganda films. There was a mock briefing, with one notable difference. The same group captain now said, as the marketplace would be filled with women and children, on no account would we bomb the centre of the town. Instead, our aiming point would be a vital railway junction to the east. I can categorically confirm that the Dresden raid was a black mark on Britain's war record. The air crews on my squadron were convinced that this wicked act was not instigated by our much respected governor, Butch Harris, but by Churchill. I've waited 29 years to say this, and it still worries me.
And so I would say that there are many, including myself, who would criticise Mr. Irving's personality. But I would say to those who would expect perfection from people that they want to admire, I would cite my elder smart sister, who actually, she quips, to people who expect too much and want everything perfectly from people, she says, well, you don't have to marry them. Well, there is no doubt of Irving's colossal achievements. In his battle in the High Court, he introduced evidence into and the evidence that was provided in the findings in the 1985 Toronto trial in Canada. It was, in fact, the only time that any eyewitnesses have been cross-examined. And this trial in 1985 was orchestrated by Professor Robert Forisson. It was conducted by barrister Douglas Christie. Thank you, Jane. It was publicized by Ernst Zundel. And their expert witness was the American expert on homicidal gas chamber operation, Fred Leuchter. Now, all of these people, and many others, certainly including David Irving, even a teaspoon of it for me, as David himself described, have all been subject to terrorism, either of their property or their person. And these are people, without any exception, who are peaceful forensic detectives, which is what normally happens with anything that is called a crime. And there is an off-limits to this crime for which you will be prosecuted, imprisoned in 20 countries. Speaking of real history denial, as opposed to Hollywood twisted renderings, later on, a Hollywood blockbuster movie called Denial, screened worldwide in many languages, was made purporting to be about the Irving-Lipstadt trial. I say purporting because this movie amounted to little more in accord with the facts than the misrepresentative marketing pitches made in most 30 seconds TV commercials. I know, since unwittingly I have been a propaganda tool acting in them for 60 years. The American professor of engineering Arthur Butts, author of the groundbreaking book The Hoax of the 20th Century, said he had noticed an actress playing my appearance in Irving's factually empty benches. He asked me, was that my kamikaze leap into his Holocaust forensic revisionism? Indeed it was. Being seen to take an interest in the battle for real history, much less endure the onslaught of the opposition, is dangerous in today's intimidating global reach of Big Brother is watching you. He's a colossus. There's no question about that. You had to witness that trial for 2 months to see the tenacity and the stamina of that man. The stamina of that man to conduct it himself. Then some of us at the end of some of those days, he would invite back to his flat in Duke Street in Mayfair. We'd see him collapse quite reasonably on a sofa. But within a few minutes, he was disturbed again by papers being sent from the other side. I would describe that as terrorism, because those papers were probably unnecessary, but he had to then deal with those papers without having a proper rest. And then in the following day, he'd get up and take his child to school before going to the trial. You really had to see the degree of this man's capacity to battle for real history, really. And without him, we would not know of the Dresden Holocaust. He produced a book in, I think it was 1963. It was, in fact, based on C.P. Snow's information.
In addition, there was the British philosopher C.P. Snow, Charles Percy Snow, who asked these dreadful questions. Snow asked, in the future, will men regard us as monsters for organising this bombing campaign? Will men regard us as monsters, and will they say that we had abandoned our humanity?
As Snow says, quoted by F.J.P. Veal, quote, all arguments concerning the British bombing of Germany during the Second World War were brought abruptly to an end in April 1961 by a single paragraph in a little book with the uninspiring title Science and Government. The author was Sir Charles Snow, scientist and novelist. His purpose in writing it was to assess the respective achievements of two rival physicists, Professor Lindemann and Dr. Henry Tizard. The book was primarily concerned to show that when the opinions of these two men conflicted, Dr. Tizard always proved to be right, and Professor Lindemann always wrong. To this he was compelled to disclose the truth concerning one of the principal issues which arose between them. In a nutshell, Sir Charles Snow disclosed that early in 1942, the exact date it now appears was March the 30th, Professor Lindemann submitted a minute to the War Cabinet in which he urged that bombing henceforth should be directed against German working-class houses in preference to military objectives which were much more difficult to hit. He claimed that, given a total concentration of effort on the production of aircraft suitable for this work, 50% of all the houses in the cities and towns in Germany with over 50,000 inhabitants would be destroyed. Sir Charles declared that the Lindemann plan to initiate terror bombing against Germany was adopted by the British government and put into action with every effort the country could make. This decision of the War Cabinet was kept a closely guarded secret from the British public for nearly 20 years, until it was unobtrusively revealed in 1961 in a little book entitled Science and Government. Quote, "Factories and military objectives had long since been forgotten, except in official bulletins. The paper claimed that, given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of aircraft, it would be possible in all the larger German towns, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses." End of quotation from C.P. Snow's book.
In his postscript a year later on the Lindemann controversy, featured in The New Scientist, Snow also quoted Professor P.M.S. Blackett on the direct outcome of the strategic air offensive. 500,000 Germans and 160,000 British and American airmen killed, but little effect on German war production or morale.
And David Irving produced a book that told us the truth and the facts behind the Dresden Holocaust, which were that our allies, their policy was to target civilians on what they call moral bombing. It was the first time, as Professor Overy noted in the newspapers here, it was the first time that soldiers could do something that airmen could do something that soldiers could not. They could not target civilians. So without David Irving's work on that in 1963, we would not be familiar with really what happened there. And secondly, the Nuremberg trials, 1945 to 46. Without David Irving's work, we would not know what a judicial farce those Nuremberg trials were. And the fact that the UN and NATO, the foundation of those two organizations, is the Nuremberg trials. So I think with gratitude, profound gratitude, please welcome David Irving.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time that I have spoken since about 2016. It was 2016, 2000, whatever. I tried speaking between here and Inverness, where I was living at the time. But since about 2016, my voice has deteriorated. But I decided to try one more time. If necessary, I can then go back to another tour of the United States, which is my favorite habit, driving all the way around the United States, visiting 50 or 60 cities and speaking. I started off with just one word: Vauxhall. Vauxhall, which is a Russian word. Nothing to do with Vauxhall. Oh, it isn't. That's a lie. Vauxhall is a Russian word. If you look in a dictionary now, you'll find that Vauxhall, V-O-K-Z or Z-A-L, is the Russian generic translation of the word station. There's two words in Russian for station: stanция, and Vauxhall. Because in 1840, a delegation came from Russia to inspect the UK railway system, and they came to Vauxhall to have a look at your magnificent station here, the magnificent railway station here. And the reason I know this because Kim Philby, your friend Kim Philby. Kim Philby was a Foreign Office spy. Am I right? Yes. He went to Russia, and he lived out the rest of his life in Russia. He eventually published his memoirs, and in his memoirs he describes how he came to Vauxhall and changed onto the underground, because at that time there was no underground station here. So it's an obvious mistranslation of the word Vauxhall, which they should have mean railway station. He came to the railway station and he transferred to the underground. So I wrote a letter to the Daily Express, I think, at the time, in 1980 or whatever, to point out that Kim Philby's memoirs were written in Russian for him. Okay. I'm going to describe a little bit where I come from, because most of you won't have heard from me. I went to an English public school, English public school in Brentwood. We had a very fine English public school and very fine teachers. I'm going to mention the names of some of those teachers now, but the guy who taught us Russian, because I was learning Russian, in fact, at school. I didn't know why they taught Russian, but they taught Russian, I suppose, and so I learned Russian, and I learned a lot of Russian poems, Odnazhdy Muzhik Uranil Svoi Topor, and so on. And this teacher told me about Vauxhall being a very important railway station. So it's kind of a gradual way that you become familiar with Russian language. I went on to university and at Imperial College down the road in Kensington. We had a Russian teacher there as well. So we carried on learning Russian. And eventually I applied for Russian when I found out that I was thrown out of the university after a time, and I found out that I could avoid national service, which would be a dreadful waste of 3 years of my life, if I applied for a Russian language course at the Royal Air Force. So I applied for a Russian language course at the Royal Air Force, where I could have served 3 years at Cambridge, no uniform, no boots. And I took all the examinations, and everything went very well. In fact, I passed the examination with such high marks. The recruitment people in High Holborn at the time, the Royal Air Force Recruitment Centre, they said you had the highest marks we've ever found in an examination. And always going, oh, thank you very much. They wrote me a letter shortly afterwards saying that unfortunately I had been declared medically unfit. I immediately applied for a steelworker job. I was a steelworker. And I applied for the steelworker job in a big German steelworks run by Fritz Thyssen, Thyssen, Fritz Thyssen. And I was accepted for a job in a steelworker. I became the dritte Schmelze auf der Ofenbühne, the third smelter on the furnace stage. And the big medical tests involved in that as well. But I passed the medical test in Mülheim with no difficulty at all. So I think the Royal Air Force probably had some reason not to accept this Mr. Irving, who was interested in the Russian language, and that's why they failed me. But a good thing, because they haven't been accepted for the steelworks. Having been denied access to the Royal Air Force, Like my twin brother, I had a twin brother, I still have a twin brother, who was approximately the same age, slightly older, about 10 minutes older than me. Twin brother. And I had an older brother. They both joined the Air Force. They were both, one rose to the rank of wing commander. Not my twin brother. Not the twin brother. So basically, I've got a kind of interested background. I still can't read Russian. I know the language and I know the words and I know what the words mean and so on. But I can't really read it fluently. The way that I've got 7 or 8 languages. No Finnish, unfortunately. Swedish either. I've got 7 or 8 languages. I picked up over the years. I picked up Spanish and Hungarian and Latin and Italian and all these languages which become useful in life as a writer particularly, and they've clung on. I speak very good languages, very good. In fact, in the courtroom quite a lot. I spoke to members of the public who came to the courtroom, which Michelle mentioned in the 2 months that I was in the High Court. We had members of the public coming, and I was able to speak to quite a lot of them in their own languages in the intervals. At school in Brentwood, we had elocution lessons. Elocution lessons. That's amazing, isn't it? Elocution. I think the elocution lesson is something beautiful. We had a teacher there called Spud Barron. He was rotund and kind of polished head, which is why we called him Spud Barron. Spud Barron taught us how to speak. I remember him saying to me when I was a very small boy, he said, "Irving, you're speaking wrong." He says, "We don't say go on. We don't say go on." I thought, we don't say, I just said it. He said, we don't say go on, not in Essex. We say gone. There's such a difference. And it means nothing to you until you know, in the old days, the BBC had a very, very fine governor called Lord Reith. R-E-I-T-H. Do you remember him? Stuart Hibbard. Stuart Hibbard was the newscaster, right? In 1945, he was the newscaster. Stuart Hibbard. And now if you listen to the BBC, the journalists, they speak a mishmash. First of all, you see a strange thing. When you're born in 1938, as I am, born in 1938, England was a different country. Totally different. We had white policemen. We had white teachers. It was noticeably different. It was many years before I first saw my first coloured man. It was in Germany, in fact. First time I saw a coloured man on a train back from Germany, from the steelworks. I think he must have come from Namibia or somewhere. One of Germany's pre-war colonies. You had Namibia. It was Deutsche Südwestafrika at the time. But that was the first time I'd seen a coloured man. Years later, when I had children, we had, I remember poor Josephine, she was the first to comment on a coloured man going upstairs. She said, "Daddy, there's a strange man going upstairs. He's a bus conductor." He says he was brown. He was a brown man, but he had a pink woman with him. Brown. I mean, it was the way a child would see things, actually with her own eyes. Brown man with a pink woman, which is now, of course, every day in London. But at the time I was born, the England I came from, it didn't happen. We had a fine school, I said. We had a headmaster at the school called Charles Allison. His predecessor was a man called Jimmy Huff. H-O-U-G-H, Jimmy Huff. He was the headmaster before Charles Allison. Jimmy Huff. Not enough, but we were, our school, the school pupils were beaten frankly. We were beaten frequently with cane. The first thing. I mentioned to American audiences, and they can't wrap their idea around being beaten with a cane. In the school I went to in Brentwood School, it was commonplace. in the old days, in Jimmy Huss Day, the entire school would be lined up for these morning appel, as they would say. I suppose there would be a morning assembly, and the names would be read out by Hector Higgs, the Latin teacher. He would read out names to Jimmy Huff, and the unfortunate boy would then be brought up from the main body of the audience from the Memorial Hall. He'd be brought up, made to bend down, and accept his punishment with stoicism in a kind of British way. Except one occasion, there was one boy, Wilberforce. Wilberforce, headmaster. We don't have Wilberforce on our list. The headmaster says, well, he's on my list. Well, he's not on my list, says Higgs. And then the headmaster says, after the punishment has been delivered, he says, oh, Wilberforce, yes, wait a minute. No, he wasn't out that. That's not what we're here for at all. Your mother's died. Go back to your class. It was a cruel school. Very, very unfortunate. But the little boy's mother had died, and so he's sent back to the classroom. Then he'd been accidentally given a beating. I suppose he was now in credit by one beating. It was a very fine headmaster, Charles Allison. He was august. He was well built. He could deliver things. I mean, my canings, they were delivered by a Danish sports teacher. His name was B.T. Shortland. Mr. Shortland. Irving, you have to go and see Mr. Shortland at 4 o'clock. Ooh. You're sent. You have to go and see Mr. Shortland at 4 o'clock, and you know what that's for. You're summoned. You're sent. You're sent for. You're summoned. You're he's had his office in the gymnasium, not an American German school or gymnasium, but the actual gymnasium where you learned how to Sportübungen. And you would go cringing up into Shortland's office on the first floor. And he said, right, now what is it? I was beaten repeatedly all the way through school, right up to the upper six arts. I went to see Mr. Shortland. He said, now let's see what you've done this time, Irving. And he would see, where's the book? Where's the entry in the black book? There's the black book, oh yes. The black book which is hanging in the master's common room, the black book. There would be one half page would just be dedicated to your latest delinquency. And you go and he says, he reads it through. He says, well, yes, it's pretty bad, right? Pretty bad. Not much we can do about it, is there? No, sir, nothing you can do. He says, well, come with me. He goes to the corner of his room, and there's an umbrella stand in the corner of the room, containing not umbrellas, but bamboo canes of various caliber. And he would then select which was the cane with the appropriate caliber for the magnitude of the delinquency that you've committed. He then selects the cane out of the umbrella stand. And there's a cushion on a chair on the other corner of the room. And he adjusts the cushion slightly. He says, right, you are standing in the room just listening to this. You're listening, because he then takes the cane and he brings it down on the cushion. No, he says, not quite right. Let's get another caliber. One slightly knobbier or thicker or whatever. You get a cane of different caliber, and that would be dealt down on the cushion. That's the sound he wanted. Come with me. And you walk all the way around the gymnasium on the first floor up to 3 sides of the main jumping area to where there's an area marked out on the floor. Die Mensur. The Die Mensur is for fencing practice with concentric rings. And you're made to stand on one ring. He says, you're going to be standing on ring number 4. 4, that's what you're going to get. And the next 4 minutes are very painful indeed. You don't want to survive it. You don't want to think about it again. but you walk very stiffly out of the room, back home again. Your mother asks what happened. And my mother was always asking what happened. Oh, my father wasn't there. He was taking the PQ convoys to North Russia. He was a naval officer, commander of the HMS Edinburgh. So it was left to my mother to bring us up. And it wasn't very easy because my other brother he had joined the Air Force, and the other older brother, he then also joined the Air Force. So, but my mother was a very wise woman. She was a very wise woman. I remember the headmaster too, Charles Allison. I've not got a word to say about him. One day he comes and he's got a heap of newspapers over his elbow. A teacher hasn't turned up that day, and the headmaster, he says, "Boys are going to listen to me today. We're going to have a class of just reading newspapers. I'm going to teach you something about newspapers." He says, I'm going to be teaching you about newspapers. They don't tell the truth. I remember he said that straight away. A newspaper doesn't tell the truth. It was the first that I'd ever even considered this prospect. Nowadays we know that every newspaper only tells the truth. But in those war years, I'm being told by my own headmaster that newspapers don't tell the truth. And he proceeded to follow the same story, just the same short story, through 6 or 7 different newspapers to prove how they didn't tell the truth. Each newspaper had its own investment, its own way of telling the truth, its own way of distorting the truth, its own way of putting spin on something. And that's something that I never forgot at that time, back in the 1940s. I never forgot that. The newspapers wouldn't tell the truth. Later on, I had Lord Beaverbrook's newspaper, Lord Beaverbrook. And now I read his letters in the House of Lords Library. And he wrote to somebody back in 1938, he said the trouble is the News Chronicle should be called the Jews Chronicle. The News Chronicle should be called the Jews Chronicle, because it doesn't tell the truth. That was Lord Beaverbrook himself. He said he was a great Canadian, he was cabinet minister. But somebody also said that same kind of thing about newspapers not telling the truth was my own mother. My own mother. They were following a big newspaper story, a great newspaper story in 1952. 1952. So by that time I was 14 years old, and the newspapers in England were full of the story of the Flying Enterprise story with Captain Carlson. Captain Carlson, a famous Danish sea captain. He stayed aboard his ship as it was sinking. It had been hit by a freak wave crossing the North Sea. And he stayed aboard his ship for 13 days as a very brave man. And the newspapers, they followed this story, Captain Carlson's heroic battle, for 13 days with great big photographs fitting every in the old days. Photographs in those days were actually made with metal blocks, not nowadays. Everything's done by digitally, but in those days everything was very, 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 very old-fashioned. Captain Carlson, Flying Enterprise. My mother said to me, he says, I'm wondering what they're doing. What is the government trying to conceal from us? Very interesting. She said she wasn't interested in the story. She said this newspapers only run stories like this for day after day after day like this if they're trying to conceal something. It's a very early lesson you learn, rather like a good day to very bad news. That was what a Labour member of Parliament said on September the 11th, 2001, wasn't it? A good day to bury bad news. If you polish it now, it would be good, because no one's going to have time to read that bad news. So a good day to bury bad news. It was in the days of Tony Blair, 2001. My mother said all this same thing, 1952. Because I used to be very interested in newspapers. We had the Daily Graphic and the Daily Mirror and the News of the World, newspapers like that, and I did a paper round as a boy did, like anybody else, a newspaper round. And I followed all the murder cases, the murder stories, like John George Haigh. John George Haigh, there he is. Am I? Okay, he's not. He's just, the name's the same as a different person.
Acid bath murderer.
You're right. John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer. I had all the press clippings about John George Haigh.
Not guilty. Not guilty.
Well, he says he denies it. He's a Holocaust. He's a murder denier. John George Haigh. Many of you have heard of John George Haigh? Obviously, these two are the person concerned. Being there, he's probably very indignant by the fact that the name has been misappropriated by this complete stranger, this cruel stranger who murdered lots of women. I think about 8 or 12. It was down the road. And was there any connection with that in Willington Place? Number 10 Willington Place. Yes, that was Kensington, I think. So I collected press clippings. I used to paste them into big picture albums. I had these picture albums until the year 2001, when all my property was taken away. All these old picture albums with famous newspaper stories I kept. Joan Woodhouse, the famous Joan Woodhouse murder case. Do you remember that? Joan Woodhouse. Her body was found in the grounds of Arundel Castle. And it was kept, the police suspected who had done it, and they conducted investigations and couldn't actually arrest anyone. But they did actually bring somebody in for questioning. And I remember this case, the Joan Woodhouse case, because it was one of those cases that I kept all the press clippings on. And she was, the police never found the actual culprit, except in the year 2012, a book was published on the Joan Woodhouse murder case. It's like you're suddenly jolted out of sleep by reading a book about a case that you've been following all your life, and they never found out who did it. And there's this book then published, and there's a guy who had been reading the files of some old solicitor or someone like that, who was a solicitor for the Duke of Norfolk. The Duke of Norfolk, whose castle was Arundel Castle. And it was a groundsman who the police had arrested. But the police, the actual identification was that the press had failed to follow up the story because the Duke of Norfolk had then ordered a complete hush up of the fact that it was the daughter of a groundsman of the Arundel Castle who was responsible. And in order to protect the identity and protect the reputation of the Duke of Norfolk, this case had been hushed up. It's one of those cases that you begin to learn about how the press goes about it, how the press hushes things up in the interest of the public. I'm sure that I would be able to speak here for hours just about the murder cases that I followed as a boy all the way through. I then went to Germany as a steel worker. I went to Germany as a Tischmelzer auf der Bühne, run by Fritz Thiessen. I was a steel worker at Fritz Thiessen's steel mill for the next year or two. And that was where I met a fellow steel worker who'd been in Dresden. And one night, when I was, because we slept 5 or 6 to a room in the dormitory in the Leedigenheim. Leedigenheim would be the unmarried quarters. Yes, there'd be 6 or 7 of us. We'd be sleeping in one room there, and we would take it in turns to use the bed and to sleep with. And we have 2 or 3. My bedmate, so to speak. He one day produced a newspaper and he said, look, this is an item about what you guys did during the war. And that was the first I'd ever heard of the Dresden air raid. I was very shocked. That would have been about 1961 that he showed me this. And I decided to follow it up. I've begun writing little articles for the Daily Telegraph they published 2 or 3 articles by me on how to be a steelworker in Germany and things like that. Then I decided to write an article about the Dresden air raid. So I did a little bit of digging, and it was true that the Royal Air Force had attacked this town in southern Germany, and they attacked several towns at that time. Another one of the same kind of character was the town of Pforzheim. Pforzheim. It's a little diamond jewellery manufacturing town in southern Germany, about 30 or 40 miles from Dresden. And we sent the Royal Air Force over there, and we did so much damage to Pforzheim that we killed one person in 3 in that town. When you consider it, there's 1 person in 3, all civilians living in a town of civilian men. You go there now, and Pforzheim doesn't mention it. You've got no mention, no trace of that. Little Pforzheim. I went and spoke in Pforzheim 10, 15 years ago. For some first time I've spoken. Great difficulty. The Germans aren't allowed to talk about this kind of thing. When I went to when I first started writing about these air raids in 1961, a magazine there published a series which was supposed to run for about, it was a series of articles, and the magazine editor told me, said, well, we're planning to, this going to run for about 10, 12 weeks, because no one's allowed to talk about this here in England, in Germany. In fact, it ran for 37 weeks in this magazine in Germany called Neue Illustrator. It's 37 weeks. I put a lot of effort into it. I interviewed a lot of the airmen. They were very brave airmen. Every airman was very young, usually about 20, 30 years old. They were brave men, all of them. Which is one reason why I had no reason to hesitate before applying for the Air Force myself. And concluded with the famous air raid on Dresden, by which time the magazine had been sold to a different publisher, and the new publisher decided to abandon the series, letting to our natural death. And they asked me to write a new series about the Arctic convoys, which is why I then wrote a book called The Destruction of Convoy PQ-17, Hitler's War.
You haven't got Hitler's War there, unfortunately.
Do I?
No, you've only got Churchill's stuff there. Hitler's War is a stunning book. It was actually in the library when you were in prison in Austria. He found his own book in the prison library.
Michelle is quite right. The following morning there was a knock on my cell door, and I'm thinking, what idiot thinks that I can just open the door? And I eventually waited kind of the requisite few minutes, and then the door was then rattle, and he produces a bunch of keys, and there's a warden outside with a bunch of keys, and he opens a prison door. Behind him is standing the governor of the prison with his arm full of my books. He said, Mr. Irving, would you do us a very great honour of signing your books? Which I then did. And I mentioned this the next time Der Spiegel came to interview me in the prison afterwards, and the local left-wing newspaper published the fact that the governor came to the prison and asked Irving to sign his books, and they were shortly removed from the prison library. I've been in prison many times. Pentonville, I know Pentonville. I've been in Hungarian prisons, Italian prisoners, German prison, quite a few. Not yet any American prisons, Canadian prisons, but not yet. Everywhere where the Jews have the say so, they can have you commuted to prison with a drop of a hat. It was in Austria. I remember in Austria the judge began reading out of the Wikipedia entry. He read the Wikipedia entry about David Irving, which isn't very flattering. From Wikipedia, I mean, in England that would be a hanging offence for a judge to read document produced outside court. And Mr. Justice Gray, he didn't risk reading what Wikipedia had written about me. I've written all this down. That's going to come after volume 2 of the part 2 of the True Himmler. We all think we know about what kind of person he was. Yet we find out, in fact, he was quite a nice guy. He wrote instructions to his daughter, Gudrun, who I met. And he writes to his daughter saying, "In life one must always be decent and brave and kind." He wrote that in 1941. In life one must always be decent and brave and kind. And he was finally, well, Wikipedia says he committed suicide. Don't believe it. We British have discovered this. We had adopted a policy of liquidating the enemy, the SS. So Himmler, there's a picture of him there, one of the pictures in the Imperial War Museum. And the newspaper says Himmler kills self. But the truth was that he was captured by 2 Russian escapees. And he was turned over to the British interrogation centre. In the British interrogation centre, he admitted straight away who he was. And he said, "My name is Heinrich Himmler, and I wish to speak to the commanding officer." And then because the first chat or two is officers like this, British officers. Yes. One wrote to the other saying, "We went through his property, and I found his 2 cyanide capsules." So the officer said, "I found Himmler's 2 cyanide capsules." I got one here. That's where the English story begins to run over. You find out the English story about his death is that this man, he had a cyanide capsule concealed in his teeth. It's a very big hunk of metal to conceal in your teeth. You couldn't do it. And in fact, if he's got the pictures of his teeth, there were no gaps in his teeth to hide this cyanide capsule in. It's manufactured by Degesch, a cyanide manufacturing company based in Hamburg. So it's unlikely that he had it. In fact, one officer writes to the other officer saying, "I found his 2 cyanide capsules and I turned them over to you. So that's what the actual document says, which is in the archives now. "I turned them over to you, sir." And this English officer then went on, after Himmler's death, he then gave these items to various others. Very interesting. In fact, Himmler had no cyanide capsule on him. When he was taken by the British officers, he was immediately seized and frog marched into a room. And I think he was within 15 minutes he was dead. He was beaten to death. That's what the picture shows. If you look closely at the photograph, you see there's no signs of. You see there's scuff marks on the floor. An autopsy was carried out, but the autopsy was carried out not for any autopsy purposes, but purely to identify, for purposes of identification. A telegram was then sent to the War Office in London saying we have caught Heinrich Himmler, and after closely identifying him, he unfortunately took his own life. If you read this as I spent several months investigating this. Then I began to realise, looking at some of the documents further back in 1944, because this suicide is supposed to have happened on May the 23rd, 1945, after the war was over. when he was actually a prisoner of war. He just volunteered who he was. If we read the British archives and the American archives, we find that there's a telegram written by Winston Churchill to Franklin Roosevelt, in which Churchill, in October 1944, says, "I propose that these prisoners, the ones who once we've identified them, we should just have them taken out and shot. After they've been clearly identified, they should be taken out and shot." And Roosevelt won't go along with that. In fact, oddly enough, Churchill then wrote, he says, "I'm seeing Joseph Stalin later on this month in October 1944, and I'll put the project to him." And Stalin said to Winston Churchill, "No," he said, "there has to be a proper trial." He says, "Otherwise people will say that we were frightened to put these people on trial." This is a very short version of the book. So the British were all for hanging, getting rid of people, having no trial. The Americans wanted the same kind of thing. And Stalin, oddly enough, not the person would have expected, was the one who stood up and said no. He says they had to be put on trial and hanged. There has to be an orderly process, an orderly trial. Probably a trial by Russian standards, but that was the Russian decision, not Churchill, not Stalin. And the history books put it the other way around. That they produced documents saying that Stalin was trying to execute 100,000 German general staff officers and so on, but that isn't true. I mean, the Russians have been set up as the enemy for the last 2 or 3 years, last 10 years, and they're still there, with Ukraine now as the victim. But the truth is quite clearly that Stalin was, in many ways, he was the good guy and wanted to do things properly. That is a very, very short version of what I say. So, as I said, I went to Germany, I became a steel worker. That's where I found out the truth about Dresden. I was very shocked by that. Maybe because I was very, very, very naive, and you're going to Germany as a young steel worker, 20, 21 years old. You're finding out these things for the first time about what the British have done. And I came back and I decided this is too big a story to write just for a newspaper. You're going to have to write a book about it. And I did 2 or 3 things. I advertised it in the Times. In those days, the Times was just a broadsheet newspaper with the whole front page was just single personal advertisements. So I advertised in the Times. If any airmen reading this were in the air raid on Dresden, would they contact me? I also advertised in, I think, Deutsche Soldatenzeitung, the German soldiers' newspaper. I would say now I'm much wiser. Now I'm wiser than about 4 or 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, it took me that long. I realised finally that the Germans are still in the pay of the Americans. And Germany suddenly makes sense when you accept that they are in the pay of the Americans. I'm not saying that in any sense of condemning them, I'm just saying it's something you have to realise. That when I first wrote my big newspaper series, 37 chapters, 1961, 62, they were still terrified. The Germans are still aware of the unspoken rule that any mention of the bombing war conducted by the Americans and the British against German cities, German civilians, that was absolute taboo. We weren't allowed to talk about it in Germany. So this is one reason why the editor was suddenly very excited. I went to see the editor of the Illustrator at the time, back in 1960. The editor was a very well-known television personality called Werner Hofer. Werner Hofer, I went to see. I was in Germany at the time without a penny left in my pocket. I'd gone round the whole of Germany with a tape recorder, interviewing people who had been in the Dresden air raid, and I'd actually I'd run out of cash, and I was staying with one of my old steelworks foreman. His name was I forget. He was I think it was steelworks for Arbeiter, something like that. He's what we'd call a foreman now. And I was staying on his sofa because I had nowhere to sleep. I was staying on his sofa, and I said, because I received telegrams from all over Germany who had been people who had been in Dresden at the time of the air raid, and they sent letters to me at the Neue Schurter newspapers. They sent letters to me, and one of them was a telegram from the Neue Schurter newspaper. This telegram said, "Dear Mr. Irving, will you please come and see us on Monday at 10 a.m. And I'd just arrived on foot from Constance or somewhere impossible, right the other end of the Autobahns. I'd got no money at all. Every penny had gone out of my pocket, and I had no money at all. And I'd been asked to go and see the editor of a newspaper at 10 a.m. on Monday. All this is my memoirs. I have to reconstruct it. And I'm thinking, should I do that? Or should I take the risk? I decided to take the risk. I went to the Cologne railway station, very famous railway station now. I cashed my ticket. I effectively tore up the ticket and I gave it to the railway station just to get a few more Deutschmarks from them. With just 10 or 20 Deutschmarks in my pocket, I was able to afford to get as far as the next town up, which was Duisburg. I went to see the Fort Arbeiter, and I said, "Can I sleep on your sofa?" I went and sat on a sofa, and I went the following day. I went to see the newspaper editor, Werner Hofer. And he said, "Mr. Irving, we're very keen to do a series on the bombing war against German cities. Would you write it for us? Are you able to do that?" And I said, "Yes, I'll be." I hadn't even got a typewriter in those days. So his Freund Naporowski says, "I thought Mr. Irving cash." So Freund Naporowski vanishes from the room and comes back in 10 minutes with a thick envelope and just handed it to me. And so suddenly I'm a writer. Suddenly. And I say, "Thank you so much." And he says, "Mr. Irving, go away and write these articles. We're planning to do 10, 15 articles." They eventually became a series of 35 wonderful articles, which I had until everything was taken in the year 2000. Wonderful articles. So it's strange, these turning points in your life at the time happened entirely by chance. I sent a telegram to my girlfriend who was in Madrid, and I said I will come down to Madrid in a few weeks' time, and then we can get married. And that's where everything there started at that end. So everything began to go right, and we had, at the same time, for some reason, the enemy had found out. It was about 6 months later I began getting strange phone calls. I got a strange phone call from somebody who maintained that he was a Hungarian. I think his name was Schmidt or something like that. And so I immediately did the correct thing. I then said, "This man says he's..." I told the British special branch. I contacted Special Branch, and I said, "This man has contacted me, and he seems to know something about me." And he says his gang are planning a bomb attentat on a Jewish organisation in London, which is meeting someday. And and it's ever since then there's been kind of these Jewish enemy creeping up from an unseen, behind strange names, odd names, and turning out to be Jews in the long run. Very strange. I reported this guy to the police, and the police said, well, can you go and meet him somewhere? I met him in the Strand Palace Hotel. I could see that out of the corner of my eye there was a policeman on the far side of the room with taking notes. And the next day they came to see me and they said, well, we followed this up and we're investigating it. And we know who's behind this. I said, well, can I tell you my theories? And they said, well, yes, tell us your theories. And I said, I think either the man is straightforward, or he's a lunatic, or he's a murderer, or he's up to something, up to no good. Anyway, I want nothing to do with it. So the police then took it forward from there. He was obviously a Jew who had been invited to set me up in some way, some kind of operation. These things happen. And as you grow older, it happens more frequently, and you learn to recognise what's going on. So, I mean, I just 3 or 4 days ago, there's a group of Swedes who are trying the same kind of thing, but I don't think they're Swedes at all. I think they're also Jews as far as I can see, and by being set up. And sometimes they succeed. And, as I say, I've been to prison several times in England and Canada, and also because they succeeded in what they're trying to do. So I took my idea to William Kimber. William Kimber was an English gentleman publisher. An English gentleman publisher, William Kimber. If you ever see books now in a library or bookshop published by William Kimber, then he's the one to go for. William Kimber was straightforward. I said to William Kimber, I'm planning to write a book about the destruction of Dresden. And he actually wrote me a letter in reply to the Times advert. And he said, Mr. Irving, you're going to write a book about the destruction of Dresden? I've always had something in my mind about that. Would you consider publishing a book with us? So I did. I went to him. I gave him. We signed a contract. His contract was for the sum of 1,000 guineas. The contract was made out for 1,000 guineas. And William Kimber was the publisher. He had previously published a book by Leon Uris called Exodus, and he was a big publisher. And when eventually Air Marshal Donald Bennett sued me for libel, when he came, he said, well, you better go and see William Rubinstein. William Rubinstein, who's my publisher and my author. He's my solicitor, William Rubinstein. He said, it's a Jewish name, but you'll find that he's very, very upright, rather like Jesus Christ. He's Jewish but upright like Jesus Christ. I won't forget those words either. Because a publisher's warning you this. I recommend that you use William Rubinstein as your lawyer because he's Jewish but he's honest. He's Jewish but he's honest, like Jesus Christ. And he was my lawyer for the next 20 years, Rubinstein. So through the next 20 years, I then assembled various legal actions behind my reputation. And I stuck it out with Rubinstein. Rubinstein and his chief assistant her name was Maxty Alexander. It turned out she was next door neighbour Otto Günscher. Otto Günscher was the man who burned Hitler's body. An SS Obersturmbannführer. He died 10, 20 years ago. So I stayed, as I say, with William Kimber as a publisher. He was a decent guy. He was a decent publisher. And I didn't like taking my next book on Convoy PQ-17 elsewhere because I liked William Kimber. But this other publisher was, his name was, I forget his name. Robin Dennison. He published for Hodder and Stoughton. And Commander Dennison turns out to have been one of the leading officers of Bletchley Park, his father. So gradually the little crossword pieces have fallen together and locking together. William Kimber, he stayed on track for the next 10, 20 years, and he finally died 20 years ago. William Kimber. And the Daily Telegraph were decent enough to telephone me and ask me if I had any reminiscences about William Kimber, and I said yes, quite a lot. And they asked me to write an obituary for him, which I then did, which the Daily Telegraph published at the time, which I was proud to do because he was a very decent publisher, which I can't say about a lot of others. William Kimber published the Dresden book, but not before another publisher had made an offer for it. The other publisher's name was Victor Gollancz. I went to Dresden in 1961, 1962 when it was all behind the Iron Curtain, and I got to know the photographer who took the photographs of the results of the Dresden air raid. In fact, I spoke to one of the airmen. I will take questions now for the remaining 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions? Put your hands up if you've got any questions.
Here, one here. Peter Rushton.
Peter Rushton, then.
Yes, Mr. Irving, at what point did the mainstream publishers of the mainstream press, who at one time had been very keen to hire your expertise, at what point did that guillotine fall and you become an unperson as far as the mainstream press is concerned?
It is a good question. But in my own private opinion, I now publish books better than my publishers of the old day would. If I went to publishers now myself, I would say I want to have 64 pages of photographs, including 20 or 30 pages of full-colour photographs. They would tap their foreheads and say, "Go away." So the main thing is I publish now books which I'm proud of. I never realised to what extent the worldwide publishers are now in one grasp. And back in 1977, when I published Hitler's War for the first time, the publisher was the Viking Press, a very famous American publishing firm, and the editor came up to me one day because I was speaking to the Viking Press's sales directors in a big hall, because it had something like this of sales directors. And the sales chief said, "Mr. Irving, we're going to have minor problems with your book about Hitler. Would you mind telling us?" And he mentioned to me that the editor of the book was actually, his name was Stan Hochman. Stan Hochman. He was a very, very fair editor. But Stan Hochman himself, he said, "I've had nightmares editing your book." Which I didn't properly understand at the time, but of course over the years you then gradually come to realise what kind of nightmares. And he said to me, you used the word Holocaust at one point. You described the air raid on Hamburg as being something about a Holocaust. And Mr. Irving got to realise that Holocaust is a word that we use only in the United States in one particular connection. So we're going to have to find another word. Bit by bit, then you gradually illuminated as to where you're going wrong. This worldwide clampdown on publishing what you want, you can forget about it. William Kimber published what I wanted, but even William Kimber allowed himself to make certain changes of the destruction of Dresden. William Kimber publishes this book also, The Mare's Nest. And all the time he would make very editorial changes. You didn't appreciate nowadays that you can't, you mustn't use the word Nazi except in this one connection, because it's the word they use to describe the Germans. Everybody is Nazi. And if you realise, after a time you realise that, gradually you realise how history is being reshaped, and you're not going to be part of it. Or you can be part of it if you want, because that's where the big money is. And you realise after a time you were going barreling down the motorway, down the highway, and you missed the turning. You missed the right turning. That turning back there was the one you should have taken. That's the one, this way to riches, this way to world fame. This was the way to where all the money is. The easy route. You missed that exit.
Somebody over there. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Have you studied Greg?
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
I'm finished.
Have you studied Greg Hallett's opinion that Hitler might have been a British agent?
I wouldn't waste time on it. I get countless letters, emails now from people who want to ask if Hitler escaped to Argentina.
Yeah.
And I had to answer these people that back in the 1960s, I had the good fortune to translate memoirs of Field Marshal Keitel. And Field Marshal Keitel was very decent. He took me into a sitting room after because I'd gone the extra mile, and I was asked to find out I asked his German editor where the whole book is, because it's quite obvious that the book is only in part the Field Marshal Keitel memoirs. And Keitel's son answered me and he said, "So you have to understand that I got all the papers of my father's memoirs here." But the editor answered me, "Mr. Irving, the reason we didn't publish all the memoirs because, for example, bits of the Keitel memoirs were very hostile. He writes hostile things about the British, who of course are our allies now, so they had to go." So he just happily, the editor allowed himself to chop out bits of this unfortunate hanged field marshal's memoirs because they'd written unpleasant things about our allies, the British. And the son was so pleased that I'd gone the extra mile and I'd asked to see the original manuscript so I could put all that back in the English manuscript, which I translated. He took me into his sitting room, opened up his ancient cupboard in the sitting room, these heavy doors, put his hand up inside and pulled down his father's field marshal's baton, the precious symbol of authority as a field marshal. Every English soldier knows what is in his field marshal's baton can be in his suitcase. And the son was so pleased that I'd gone the extra mile. He said, I'll do something else. He said, if you come back 2 or 3 days' time, I'll take you 100 yards down the road to where Otto Günscher lives. Otto Günscher? I said, Otto Günscher? Is he still alive? He said, yes. He came back from Russia 5 years ago, and he lives down the road in Cologne. So 3 days later, I found myself walking down the same street, and Field Marshal Keitel's son ringing the bell, the door being opened. They're one of the very first. Grundig, one of the very first tape recorders, and I had one of them. I had it tucked under my arm. Rang the doorbell. Otto, says Field Marshal Keitel's son. Otto, das ist der David Irving. Das ist der Engländer, der das Buch über Dresden geschrieben hat. He's the Englishman who wrote the book about Dresden. And he wants to interview her. So I walk into Otto Günscher's front room, and for the next half hour I'm sitting there taping, and the very first live interview with Otto Günscher, the man who burned Hitler's body. And she described to me exactly how it went off. He says that he got a summons on the morning of April the 30th to Hitler's room down in the bunker. And he went to see the Führer, and he says, "Jawohl, mein Führer." And he's Obersturmbannführer at that time. Otto Günscher was a tall, blonde, handsome man at that time. And he goes in and says, "Jawohl, mein Führer, you sent for me?" And Hitler says to Günscher, "Yes, I want you to know that at 3:30 this afternoon, meine Frau und ich werden aus dem Leben scheiden. My wife and I will both depart this life at 3:30. And he said, the Russians must find nothing. They must find this room as I leave it. But they must not be allowed to touch my remains." He says, "I want you to be in charge of the cremation of myself and my wife." Because Hitler had married his long time Eva Braun, his Lebensgefährtin, a couple of days earlier. And they carried the body upstairs. He says, Heinz Dinger, Hitler's valet, carried Hitler's body wrapped in a blanket, with just Hitler's black shoes poking out of the body, poking out of the blanket, with the body actually wrapped in a blanket. And Otto Günscher carried Eva Braun's body upstairs. He says that he realized after he came back downstairs after carrying out the grisly routine outside in the Reichschancellor garden, he said he went back downstairs, and he said he realized his tunic was smelling of cyanide, which doesn't happen in Himmler's death. Isn't there cyanide smell? So he said, "That's how I know." And I had this tape recording of Otto Günscher speaking to me until all my files were seized in 2000. After the trial, the Lipstadt trial, everything was seized. All the tapes and everything were taken. So there we are. But before that, I typed up a complete copy of the Otto Günscher interview, and all the interviews, all Hitler staff, his adjutants and people like that. I typed them all out. And the typescripts I kept. And I deposited the typescripts in the Institute of History in Munich, so they're still there. It's one of the reason I did this, I remember saying this many years earlier, when Kimber said to me, William Kimber, he said, "Mr. Irving, what are you going to write next?" I said, I intend to write a book about Adolf Hitler. And he said, "Oh, well, yes, you're very good." And I could see that he wasn't all that keen. And he says, "Do you have any kind of special?" And I said, "I've spoken to all the people, and I will speak to all the rest. And I have the impression that they've all told me the truth about him. They had the impression that they were working for an honourable man, that he was an honest man, and he wanted the best for Germany, and that's the Hitler I write about." Oh, well, yes. You could see that he was kind of half interested, but Hodder and Sultan, they saw what was really behind it. They got the idea. And Stan Hoffman, he got the idea too. It was you mustn't write about Hoffman, you mustn't write about Holocaust, and I didn't write about that. So I've had a full career, and it's still carrying on for the next 5-10 years. I shall carry on writing. And I'm very happy to speak to audiences like you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. My first. It has been an interesting experience. A live audience. That's proven out.
I was going to say your books are for sale. Absolutely.
Yeah, I brought them along in case. I brought them all along if you want to look at them and get them post free here. Otherwise, you can. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, one final point. The reason I mentioned the Hitler's War book is there's one final document which I publish in the picture section towards the end of the book. And it's a letter from, it's an instruction which is being forwarded by SHAEF headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, Eisenhower's headquarters, and he's instructed his chief censor, and the chief censor writes this letter, which I published in a facsimile, and he says, you mustn't mention the fact that we are using white phosphorus bombs, because white phosphorus bombs are forbidden by the Geneva Convention. So it has not been mentioned that we've been using white phosphorus bombs. And also a strange thing there, we're not to mention how we are processing prisoners who belong to the SS. It's a very strange kind of injunction saying we're not to mention how we are processing prisoners who belong to the SS, as though something is happening to them. And it all begins to click. It all begins to click. You realise then why there's so few top SS commanders still alive. Hans Pritzmann, for example, was taken to the same house in Lüneburg 2 days before Heinrich Himmler was taken. Strange thing. Hans Pritzmann, I mean, he's mentioned there by name. There was the day when he was taken in. The following day he was taken out again by the special unit. And he was apparently, you look up in a different source, you find out that Hans Pritzmann committed suicide. And you begin to realise that these people didn't commit suicide at all. There was obviously a dedicated British team of soldiers who went from camp to camp, taking out certain prisoners. These are weeks after the war's over, and murdering them, killing them.
Rudolf Hess didn't commit suicide.
What?
Rudolf Hess didn't commit suicide.
No, he didn't commit suicide. He was strangled by his black prison guard. That's years later. But this was part of a dedicated program. Yes.
Can I ask you a current question? Do you think that we are at the moment stumbling into World War III?
Yes, but I think that it is a serious problem, and it's a strange coincidence. A lot of the same people are involved again, except Henry Kissinger has now advised, he said, stop this war while we have time.
Do you think, as a result of your view on that, it would be better if Zelensky decided to surrender?
Yeah. I think Ukraine has now been totally taken over financially by the Americans. I think the Americans have got a lot of hands in the sticky business, and I blame the Americans for all of this. They don't realise what they're getting into.
Can I ask you a question?
I have to emphasise that I've not been to Ukraine. I have been to Russia 4 or 5 times. I have been to Russia 4 or 5 times. It's a country which I liked. It struck me as being very homogeneous all over. And I emphasise the word homogeneous. I have to be careful who I speak to here. Homogeneous. Homogeneous is not an attack on the sexual virility of the people, but it's homogeneous is a reference to the racial makeup. And I think the Russians were impressed in that respect. What was your question again?
I was asking whether the British forces that took part in the Dresden bombings ever contacted you. What happened to them?
They did. I received about 20 or 30 letters in reply to my Times advertisement. I received very many more German survivors who wrote to me at the time. And I went to interview all these airmen that I could, including the two master bombers. There's an English master bomber who was a Wing Commander, Maurice Smith, who was actually the chief editor of Flight International magazine when I went to interview him. A man could only be really respected as being very dedicated and professional RAF officer. And I remember asking him what he was thinking about when he flew around over Dresden 1,000 feet up in a mosquito plane, which was a little wooden plane. And he said, "Mr. Irving, I have my hands full." And I didn't have time to think of very much else. I reflected. I showed him the photographs that I have of the results on the ground. Because by that time I'd obtained 20 or 30 full colour photographs of the results on the ground in Dresden. And he looked at the photographs for a while, and he actually blushed. He blushed. And he was a very honest man. And it's the kind of thing I respect. It reminded me years later, when my father died in 1967. And he asked me buried at sea. So I drove with my two brothers down to Bangor to pick him up in his coffin. And we drove from Bangor Hospital to the local crematorium. I remember after a time we turned left, and at the crossroads there was an English policeman. And when he saw the Union flag draped over the coffin, he saluted. You wouldn't see that now. Thank you very much.